Watching News at Prime. Let's get into this conversation now. The Parliamentary Land Reform and Rural Development Committee is calling for changes in legislation that governs the Ingonyama Trust. The call comes after the committee's oversight visit to the trust recently. Ingonyama Trust has come under scrutiny following the governance and legal issues surrounding it. Now, to respond to these parliamentary calls for the legislative review, I'm joined by the Ingonyama Trust Board CEO, Vela Mngwengwe, who talks to us all the way from Pietermaritzburg this evening. Mr. Mngwengwe, good evening to you and thank you for your time. These are the proposals by the Parliamentary Committee. Do you believe, as the Ingonyama Trust, that this legislative review is necessary, as they put it?
Good evening, Xoli, and good evening to your viewers as well. We haven't seen the proposals as Ingonyama Trust yet, but as the administrator of the trust, the board has looked at the weaknesses in legislation and come to a conclusion that there is a need for review too. Though we may not necessarily be looking at the same things, but because of the controversies that have been going on recently, the board came to a conclusion that it will not initiate those proposals because its intentions might be misconstrued, even though it's quite clear that there needs to be some form of review.
Yeah. I'll quote a little bit of what the chair of the committee, Mr. Albert Mngwango, has had to say as to why it is that they feel it is important for a legislative review of the Ingonyama Trust legislation. And they're saying the important issue of material benefits to the communities listed in the legislation is of vital importance. It would seem that for them, what drives this review, or what has got to be at the center of it, are the communities that reside on this land that is administered by yourselves.
Okay. I think until we see what is the substance of what they are actually proposing, it's difficult to comment, except to say that the legislation as it stands now, it imposes an obligation on the board to ensure that it manages the trust in such a way that communities do benefit. So I think the only unfortunate circumstance has been that the trust has not been adequately capacitated in the past so that it is able to discharge that obligation. So as a consequence, the trust has relied specifically on traditional councils to be the planners of what needs to be done with the resources of those communities. And therefore, we've only been relating to traditional councils, but not necessarily with the people concerned. And even in the case of traditional councils, where we have made resources available, we have not had the capacity to be able to monitor what eventually happens with the money that gets given to traditional councils. So there are those weaknesses, but we are trying to capacitate the organization now so that it is able to discharge that obligation.
A recent court ruling made this instruction, and that is that the trust should stop renting out land to residents. Do you abide by that particular court judgment?
Yes. In fact, the reason why, okay, maybe let me put it this way. That court judgment was decided in June 2021. The board that existed at the time decided to appeal, and it ran through Supreme Court of Appeal on one aspect of the issues that it had identified, which was the recusal of the judges up until it lost in the Constitutional Court. But it also it then pursued the appeal on other grounds, and then there were changes in the board in 2023. So the board that came took a view that to appeal that decision seems to be conveying a message that the board is not acting in the interest of its beneficiaries. Because the substance of the judgment was that the people that were entering into residential leases with the board were people that otherwise have indigenous right on the land, and as a consequence, their rights were being taken away and they were being given leases which had limited time period in terms of application, which could be cancelled in given circumstances.
Yeah.
And therefore, the very existence of those leases constituted some form of threat to the indigenous rights of the beneficiaries of Ingonyama Trust. So that was the view of the court, and the board that exists now agrees with that view. And as a consequence of which, it abandoned the appeal when it was about to be heard in November 2020. Was it 2024? No, 2023, I think. In November 2023, and then started complying with the judgment in terms of the repayments that the court ordered. So we've been implementing that since December 2024.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And I suspect the committee will probably have been comforted by the stance that you are now taking as it relates to the rental issue. But nonetheless, there has been governance and legal challenges, particularly what was seen as the unlawful suspension of board members by the king. As things stand, does the Ingonyama Trust Board accept that the king does not have the powers to suspend board members?
That's the view that the board took immediately when the suspensions came up. I mean, the practical issue here is that you have a board that comprises of 9 members, and one of those members is His Majesty. So the legislation is structured in such a way that oversight over the board is played by the executive authority in the form of the Minister of Land, Reform and Rural Development, as well as Parliament. So in view of that, a member of the board, therefore, would not have authority to dismiss or suspend others because the oversight over the board is exercised by the executive in the form of the minister and by Parliament.
Okay, but I still don't have the clear answer from yourselves as to the action of the king when he took that particular decision to suspend board members. Did he know or did he not know that he did not possess such powers?
His Majesty obviously didn't know, because His Majesty has evidently acted on legal advice provided by lawyers who are admitted to have gone through law schools and passed law degrees. So His Majesty was acting on the basis of advice, and that advice had said to him, he has the authority. So as a consequence, though His Majesty acted in the manner that he did, but we appreciate that he believed because his lawyers were advising him to do so.
Finally, let's talk about the 300 communities that we understand are beneficiaries of the land on which they reside, and whether or not the board, the Ingonyama Trust Board, has the interests of those communities at heart. As we end this conversation, what's your message to those 300 communities that reside on the Ingonyama Trust land, and what it is that they should look forward to as the new particular committee, or should I say the new board, presides over this?
The Ingonyama Trust, in terms of the schedule to the Act, it has got 249 communities. But the provincial government, in terms of the Constitution, is empowered to establish traditional communities. So in exercising that power, the provincial government does recognize new communities. So there's one, for instance, that was recognized in 2016, and as a consequence, we now have 250. That number might still grow because over a period of time, some communities may get recognition as traditional communities, and therefore they become beneficiaries of the trust in that manner. So the board takes the view that it has an obligation to the true beneficiaries of this trust, which are the communities concerned, of course, together with their leaders by virtue of being members of those communities. So the way in which the board has operated in the past is that it has focused so much on the leaders as opposed to their communities. We are trying to get that message to the leaders too, to say, the best way that you will have normality in your areas, the best way that you will have respect and recognition by your own people is if you ensure that the resources at your disposal, at our disposal, they do find their way into your communities. So it's a message that we are passing through. But what we have now done is that we've now taken concrete steps as the board. The board has decided that it wants to focus specifically on education, because the trust doesn't have sufficient resources, though it has the capacity to get more resources. So in the meantime, what we have said that in the next 5 years, we're going to focus on education. We're going to look at both beneficiary students who are going to tertiary institutions, and also on early childhood development. We believe that that's where the focus should be, but at the present moment, we are not ready to really intervene substantially at that level. As a consequence, we're going to be focusing at those that are going to tertiary institutions. So that will give direct benefits to the beneficiaries of the trust, because what we're saying is Ingonyama Trust must be different. It must invest in people as opposed to investing in infrastructure, for instance, which is what government does. Yeah. So we want to invest in our people because we want their areas to be developed. We understand that once people are educated, they don't necessarily reside in their areas. We don't want to force them to reside in their areas, but we're hoping that we can catch some of them to develop sufficient love for their areas that they could come back and give back to their areas. So that's what we want to focus on, and that's what we'll be doing from April going forward.
Beautiful message indeed. Vela Mgwengwe, let me thank you very much for your time. Ingonyama Trust Board CEO, striking a slightly different note to perhaps what the public has come to know of the Ingonyama Trust Board. We'll leave it to you to make up your mind about the intentions of this new leadership.